Good evening and welcome to Newsmakers. The Chinese Communist Party is being accused of waging a different type of war in the United States. Yet it's not troops and tanks that has U.S. representatives worried. Instead, it's the buying up of American land.
Well, Florida made headlines in January when Governor Ron DeSantis declared the CCP was gobbling up land. He said in particular it's not in the interest of the state to have the Chinese regime owning farmland or owning land close to military bases. He declared China as a hostile nation. He also stated the CCP's influence on American society has been very insidious.
And the issue has been on a slow boil for years, going back to at least 2017, when the FBI and other federal agencies have been calling out what they said was a dramatic escalation of CCP espionage in the United States. At the time, CNN noted that federal officials were investigating Chinese land purchases near critical infrastructure, and there were concerns that the regime was trying to install listening devices near U.S. military bases and government facilities.
Now, earlier I spoke with South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who is enacting bold measures to counter the threat of the Chinese Communist Party and also its allies. Noem recently signed an executive order that prohibits the Chinese Communist Party, Russia, North Korea, and Iran from purchasing farmland or property near military bases. Hey, Governor Kristi Noem, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, you just signed Executive Order 2023-02, which specifically prohibits the Chinese Communist Party from purchasing agricultural land property near military bases in the U.S. I know there were some headlines on this, and we thought something was being done about it. Why do you think this executive order is necessary with this?
Well, so if you remember last year, we had an incident up in North Dakota, our neighbors to the north, where the Chinese Communist Party and foreign entities were buying up ag land. And they were buying ag land near military installations, which they were saying was for a different purpose, but we recognize the real national security threat we have. And my executive order specifically bans telecommunications companies from doing business with South Dakota and our state government, and also us having state contracts with foreign entities. It's specifically targeted towards countries that hate us. And listen, these are evil governments that want to undermine the United States of America and want to take away our freedoms and liberties. So my job as governor is to protect the people of South Dakota. This executive order builds the momentum for preventing people from doing business with the state of South Dakota that hate us. And then also we're bringing legislation that would ban them from being able to buy our ag land and generate the kind of threat that we saw from our neighbors to the north.
Well, you know, not everyone's going to call the Chinese Communist Party evil on the surface, although frankly, look at their genocidal practices. I think it's an accurate term, I'm just being honest. But a lot of people won't say that outright. You've taken a very strong stance here. You're calling the Chinese Communist Party an evil regime. Why do you say that?
Well, we all know they're bad actors. For generations, they've been building up their military. They've been stealing our intellectual property, manipulating their currency to undermine the United States of America. They're communists who have horrific human rights activities going on, or lack of human rights in their country. And we've seen them buying up our food supply chains as well. You know, I've talked for 15, 20 years that I've been working on food policy in the United States of America about how important it is that we continue to grow our own food in this country, because then we control our own destiny. When another country grows our food for us or controls it, that's when they truly do control us. And we've seen China buy up our fertilizer companies, our chemical companies, our processing systems. Now they're coming after our land. So they're not a bunch of dummies. They hate us. They want to destroy us. And every action that they take is to undermine our freedom. That's why I banned TikTok in the state of South Dakota from anyone within state government from accessing the platform, why I've taken this executive order to ban state contracts with them and telecommunications companies from participating with these evil governments, and why we're bringing legislation to ban them from purchasing our ag land as well.
Well, and just to clarify too, so you're of course calling out China, and I think that's the probably biggest name in the game. But you're also talking about other U.S. enemies or countries that regard the United States as an enemy. What are these other countries, and why are they kind of part of these bans as well?
Well, this executive order lists several countries. It includes Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, those that hate us. So it lists several specific countries that have long been our enemies. And this isn't new developments. We know that we've faced these threats for many, many years, but it specifically calls them out and says we should not be doing business with them. We should not be participating with them and giving them the opportunity to collect data on our citizens and use it against us. So we've done this in many other areas. And frankly, the reason that I have to take this action as governor is because our president isn't protecting us. Joe Biden is AWOL. He's been a horrific president as far as national security issues. He's not protecting us from evil governments. And that's why governors like myself have to step up and take action such as this.
Well, can you explain that a bit more? Because I remember going all the way back to the Obama administration, there were studies coming out on what they called supply chain threats. And they listed, for example, Huawei and these other Chinese telecom companies, ZTE was among them, I believe, as well. And they understood this was a threat, and they talked about it as being a threat. And we also saw a lot of talk about TikTok being a national security threat, but nothing was ever really done. So how is it they can acknowledge it's a threat and make a big deal about it, but never really enact anything serious? I mean, I guess in your eyes, because I assume maybe you see things differently where you're at, but why is there this discrepancy between words and actions when it comes to these foreign threats?
I think we've seen this for many, many years in politics. People say a lot of big things, they never take the action to do it. But now we've seen that it's imperative that we actually back up these words with protecting our citizens. The last several years, we've seen governments come in and take away people's freedoms and liberties that I never dreamed was possible. Because the government told people they couldn't go to church anymore, people gave up their freedom of religion. Because the government told people that they couldn't get together and meet in big groups, they gave up their freedom of assembly. And we thought we were just under threat from our own federal government, but then we became more and more aware about how our own federal government was participating and allowing China and other evil governments to come in and utilize these platforms and these companies against us. And because it was easy and we weren't disciplined at the federal government level, we were allowing them to have access to information that they could use to control us. So I've worked on food policy for probably 20 years now. I've seen them infiltrate our food supply chain. I've seen them control different supply chains, buy up processing plants. In fact, there's been programs in the federal government that allowed people to literally invest in processing systems for our food manufacturing here in the United States in exchange for citizenship. And they've infiltrated our country now to where now they're purchasing land, and they may be purchasing this land not necessarily to grow food, but to get a presence close to some of our national security bases that they should not have any logistical latitude to be near. We have Ellsworth Air Force Base here in South Dakota. It's going to be the first base in this nation to have the B-21 bombers, the next generation bombers. The most horrific thing that could happen is if China was able to come in and purchase land that would be near Ellsworth that would allow them to conduct surveillance on that new bomber that we're going to use to protect our country far into the future.
Thank you. Well, just 20 seconds left. Any last message for Americans? Like, why should we care about this? What does food have to do with national security with China? Why should people care about this?
Well, this is about our kids. At the end of the day, we have been a generation that has lived the benefits of the United States of America. What kind of a country are we going to leave them? Are we going to leave them free? Are we going to leave them with the same opportunities that we had the chance to enjoy? So this kind of action and being willing to fight these kind of fights to protect our freedom is incredibly important, that at this time we be sacrificing enough to be willing to take the action that's necessary to preserve this greatest experiment in human history, what the gift that our founders gave us, and that is the United States of America.
Hey, Kristi Noem, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
With the House now under Republican control, Speaker McCarthy is now appointing 5 representatives to the Powerful Rules Committee. Now, traditionally, those spots have gone to party loyalists, but 2 new members are Freedom Caucus members.
Those 2 members are Representatives Ralph Norman and Chip Roy, both of whom initially opposed McCarthy for House Speaker. But they were willing to change their vote after McCarthy agreed to certain concessions, like giving Freedom Caucus members seats on the Rules Committee.
McCarthy's appointment of Freedom Caucus member fulfills his promise during his battle for House Speaker, and it could have wide-ranging impacts on this.
That's because the Rules Committee is arguably one of the most powerful committees on the Hill. In a nutshell, it's responsible for saying how and when priorities are brought to the floor, and it's responsible for allowing or denying amendment votes on legislation. Joining us now to discuss all of that and more is the newly appointed Rules Committee member himself, Congressman Norman. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.
So to begin, you and a group of Republicans initially opposed McCarthy as Speaker until he agreed to certain concessions. Why were seats on the Rules Committee so crucial to you?
Well, first of all, Kevin McCarthy has done everything he said he was going to do. Appointing conservatives on the different committees was part of that. My big ask was on the budget, where we're on a path that's unsustainable as far as our spending and how we're handling tax dollars. But no, the Rules Committee is powerful because every bill comes through the Rules Committee. Under Nancy Pelosi and her, and I call it reign of terror, they were basically closed rules. You couldn't have amendments. We found out about most of them the day before. They did not go through regular order, going through the committees and then going where we had honest debate. There were no bipartisan bills that I can remember that under Pelosi that took place. Now it's a new day. And now on the Rules Committee, you've got conservatives. There's 9 conservatives, 4 Democrats. It's going to be a new day with the rules, and it's going to be a new day with what hits the floor, and it's going to be a new day with the American people seeing an up or down vote on things that we should vote on. With Ms. Pelosi, it was mainly window dressing, and she had to have her stamp of approval on everything, and that's not the case with Kevin. He's given us free reign, and I look forward to the debate.
Well, how is it going to change things with you on the Rules Committee? What do you see changing through this?
Well, what you have, and it's not just with me. I mean, look at Chip Roy. Look at Thomas Massey. We're outspoken. We were willing to take the risk of a lot of things that could have harmed us by going against the Speaker. But it turned out we had great rules that will benefit this country, and we had, we will speak up and we will battle for the things, for conservatism, in short, is what we're going to battle for. And Congress is made up of 435 different individuals. With who's on the Rules Committee now, you will see a marked change on votes on bills that come before the floor. They'll be single subject, they'll have to be germane, and they'll have to go through our committee. And while the 3 of us can't control it, we will have our input, and we will battle for what we think is right and what we think is just for America.
And Congressman, you mentioned how McCarthy has kept all of his promises so far. So what other concessions did he make to you all?
Well, it was big for me with the 10-year budget. I had originally asked him with the caucus, would you agree to the RSC, Republican Study Committee, 7-year budget? And he just said no in front of all the caucus members. And that's when I'd had it. I said, no, we've got to, there's no more 20-year budgets. That's a pie in the sky. The American people are not going to buy that, nor should they. So what he's agreed to do is a 10-year balanced budget. You will see that in the coming weeks. You have reported the debt ceiling crisis that will hit. America has got an addiction, and it's spending. And we've got to have a downward trajectory, and we're going to do that. Starting next week, our office will be putting out some things that we think are on the table for cuts. Every agency in Washington, D.C. ought to be on the table. As the families, when they do their budgets, when businesses have to balance their budgets, same thing with the federal government. It's high time that we put that in place, and you'll see it. We got the people in place to do it.
McCarthy just announced 2 select committees, ones he was talking about for a while now, one being the weaponization of government and the investigations into the origins of the pandemic. Now, why do Republicans see these 2 in particular as important?
Well, first of all, on the investigations of the COVID virus, it's killed 1 million Americans. And whenever anyone questioned the origins of where it came from in China, we all know it wasn't a bat that all of a sudden got out of the cage or got out of a tree and infected human beings or infected them through animals. That's a joke. Fauci, I think, fed us a line for a long time. I'm looking to, hopefully we can defund his agency and defund his salary as well. But no, it ought to be investigated, and let's let the facts lead us to the conclusion. And if anything else, the American people have that right, just like they have the right on the vaccine to find out what's in that. But for something that big to shut down that many businesses, to cost that much money for America, it ought to be investigated.
And Congressman, lastly, what are you hoping Republicans will achieve with control of the House?
One thing, I've never seen a party as united as we are. Are we going to have our fights? Yes, and rightfully so. But it'll be for the good of this country. You're going to have our fight. We will have our fights in open debate. It'll go through regular process. To me, economic security is national security, pure and simple. If you're bankrupt, you can't fund the programs like the military that needs to be funded. And when you're paying close to our whole entire defense budget, $700 billion, which is interest, soon to be interest only on the debt, it's a wake-up call for everybody. So I hope to get the finances in order, cuts in place, and cut regulations, and do a host of other things that will pay dividends for this country. And I think we're well on the way to do it, and we got the people that'll make it happen.
Congressman, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Congressman Andy Biggs, who's here to discuss the latest with Biden and his classified documents. Plus, what's going on with America's debt? We'll find out after the break.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American Congressman Graves? Thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you're in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit.
At NTD Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. NTD Business. I'm Paul Green.
At The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back. The classified documents scandal unfolding around President Joe Biden is expanding. FBI agents searched the president's home in Wilmington, Delaware, where they allegedly found 6 new items of documents with classified markings. And according to these reports, these are not limited to his time as vice president under Barack Obama. They may even date back to his time as senator. Now, earlier I spoke with Representative Andy Biggs about the new revelations. Let's jump into that. Hey, Congressman, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Well, it seems this classified document scandal with President Joe Biden is getting bigger. There are now 5 different batches of classified documents. We don't know how many in each one. Biden had from when he was vice president, and now it's possibly when he was a senator as well. And the House Oversight Committee is now promising oversight on that. I guess, what's your latest on this investigation?
Well, I mean, right now we're kind of what's in the public domain. We know that there were five troves. We don't know what else. We know that the timeline's messed up because we don't know when they first discovered versus when they first reported. So we need to get to the bottom of that. We don't know, I mean, how far back they go. We thought originally that they just went back to when he was vice president, when Biden was vice president, which meant 6 years ago, right? And now the suggestion is back when he was senator. Now think about that. He was a vice president for years, out of office, then the president. So how many years is that before you go back to when he was a senator? So we don't know who had access. They tell us there's no log of the vice president's residence, but apparently he's had these for years. So I mean, it is really a deep scandal that's going to require a lot of work to unpack, and it's like that little rubber band ball that's underneath the baseball's covering. You know, it's just you got to pull it apart and see what's there, because it never seems to end.
As a member of Congress, I assume you've gone to the room and you've looked at these classified documents. I mean, now that it's coming out that it's possible that when Joe Biden was still a senator, he was taking classified documents, like, what does that look like for a member of Congress?
Well, so there are several what we call SCIFs that you go to, and when you go in, you give your cell phone over, you sign in, you're there, and they're gonna sign you in to look at a specific document. They're gonna present that document to you. You have no way of copying that document. When you're done, you turn that document back over to the person who's in charge of that SCIF. So I do not know how in the world a sitting senator or congressman or congresswoman could actually take and lift documents and get them out the door even. You would have to, you have to come in prepared to substitute or something, but they would, I'm sure they would find out and be able to track you down, but because everything is monitored and observed. So I don't even know how you get them out. I don't know how you get them out.
Well, that raises some pretty serious questions in and of itself then. Yeah. Another thing is the Department of Justice right now, they're saying that they're refusing to cooperate with Congress to some extent, at least with the House. They're refusing to hand over some information. You also mentioned something important, which is the timeline. We don't know the full timeline yet in terms of when these were known about versus when they were exposed. And the Justice Department as well is being called out on this. Can you explain to us where the Justice Department is with this? And I mean, let's just be blunt. It looks like they're kind of colluding by, if they were aware of this and did not release things publicly, I guess, could that be called collusion? And what does it mean when they're stonewalling the release of information needed for an investigation?
Yeah, so when we talk about collusion, I think everybody needs to understand what we're talking about are people that are working together to obtain an objective. In this sense, it seems nefarious. It seems like a cover-up, quite frankly. Let's just call it what it looks like. It looks like a cover-up and that they were colluding. So there's all kinds of things that go hand in hand that way. Timeline goes into it. Why didn't you release that? I mean, you released Trump. I mean, why did you wait until post-election, not just post-election, but right in the first beginning of the new congressional session? Why did you wait to release those documents? And in the meantime, you found additional documents, and then you dripped those out as well. There seems to be a problem there. So that's one way that it looks like they're colluding. But the other way is, how did you pursue it? We were told that DOJ had actually gave permission to Biden's private attorneys to conduct a search and look for documents. What? What is that about? I mean, if these are classified documents, you do not let somebody who's representing, who has an ethical obligation to protect Joe Biden, you don't let them be the ones that are your search dogs for it. It has to be DOJ. So it looks like DOJ is colluding on that end of it, and the other end of it, they're not answering the questions that James Comer, the Oversight Committee chair, has requested that they answer. And so we're going to be pressing them on that going forward as well.
And not to mention that it's the same Department of Justice that didn't want a special master looking at Trump's documents because they said they were classified. Who are these lawyers who are more qualified than a special master? But Congressman, real important questions to ask. Hope you keep us updated on what's going on. Always a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Thanks, and we'll keep you posted.
And joining us after the break, we're joined by Sebastian Gorka. President Biden is sending M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, saying that Europe supports the move. We'll get Sebastian's take on this after the break. Welcome back. We're a month away from the one-year anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. And while most experts thought Russia would quickly move in and overwhelm Ukraine's force, that's not what happened.
Instead, Ukraine has managed to resist and fight back against Russian forces. But part of that success is because Europe and the United States were backing Ukraine.
Weapons, money, sanctions, you name it. And Russia is less than thrilled about it and has repeatedly warned the U.S. not to get involved, threatening military escalation.
Well, despite Russia's threat, President Biden announced that the United States is sending 31 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, and he said Europe fully supports the United States decision. Now, joining us to discuss that is former strategist for President Donald Trump, Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian is also a counterterrorism expert and has served in the British Army Reserve's Military Intelligence Unit and also worked for the U.S. Defense Department. Hey, Mr. Gorka, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, some people say that the Ukraine is fighting a proxy war between the United States and Russia. What does sending M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine really mean for kind of the U.S. involvement with this?
Well, it's a stupid move, in my opinion. It's not what the Ukrainians need. The M1 Abrams tank is not something Ukrainians have ever used. They haven't been trained on. They don't have the ammunition for it. Since the beginning of the war, I've been very clear. This is the Ukrainian nation's war to fight. We can assist them, but we have to assist them in ways that make sense. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. It knows how to use Soviet-era equipment, whether it's the AK-47 or the T-series of tanks or the BTR series of armored personnel carriers or RPGs. There are lots and lots of Soviet-era equipment and ammunition in the newer NATO nation states that were part of the Warsaw Pact, like Poland. like Hungary, like the Baltic states, like Romania. That's why Poland originally offered, if you recall, to provide a MiG-29 aircraft, Soviet-era aircraft, to Ukraine if those were backfilled by F-16s from America. First, the Biden administration said, yes, that's a great idea. And then 48 hours later, they said, no, we don't think Ukraine needs MiG-29. So if they don't need MiG-29s, why would they need M1 Abrams tanks they have no experience with? So provide them with stuff they can use and they know how to use, not pallets of cash and not American equipment. Again, it's just another example, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that this administration has no idea what it is doing when it comes to geopolitics and national security.
And Sebastian, on that note, in your opinion, then, how might Russia respond to all of this?
Look, they will be more bellicose, will be more vociferous and vituperative. Vladimir Putin will rattle his rusty saber, but he's in big trouble. If you look at the performance of Russia in the last year against the Ukraine, remember when this war began in February, Russia was ranked second in the world after the United States in terms of military might, with 5,000 nuclear warheads, large military, relatively sizable defense expenditure. Ukraine was ranked 22nd. So Russia, number 2, Ukraine, 22. And Ukraine, despite being 22nd in world rankings, has fought Russia to a standstill, has managed to recapture territory that Putin's forces took from Ukraine. So it's not as if he has a lot of moves left. He had to mobilize recruits. He had to have a new recruiting drive because of the poor performance. And he has lost a lot of equipment, whether it's rotary wing aircraft, whether it's tanks or armored personnel carriers. The Russian military has not performed well. So his options for upping his game are relatively limited.
You said in the past that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and America's involvement is complicated, and there's a middle ground between sending tanks and staying entirely out. Now, what should America have done really to support Ukraine? What do you think is the more reasonable way that the U.S. should be involved?
Yeah, very soon after the conflict erupted, I wrote a piece, and I stand by my original recommendations back then. So we have to understand, a KGB colonel invading somebody else's territory and stealing their territory is wrong. It doesn't matter whether there's corruption in Kiev or whether there's corruption in general in Ukraine. There's corruption in Washington, D.C. That doesn't mean we should allow Chinese tanks to roll down Constitution Avenue. This is a sovereign nation that we said we would help protect after the Budapest Memorandum, and they foolishly decided to give their nuclear weapons to Russia, after which we said, along with Britain, that we would help secure that nation. Well, if they had those nuclear weapons today, Putin would never have been invaded. So my recommendations from the beginning have been to supply Ukraine with what is useful to them, which is Soviet-era equipment from NATO nations that inherited Soviet-era equipment, like Poland. Secondly, to provide them ammunition, because this is an ammunition-intensive war, whether it's artillery, small arms, or what have you. And then lastly, because of America's peerless position in terms of ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, we have military satellite capabilities that nobody else has, and we need to be providing data packets. We need to be providing target sets to Kiev so they can hurt the Russian forces effectively and fight them to a standstill and make them think about going back home. That's what America should have been doing 6 months ago, 4 months ago, and that's what they should be doing now. No tanks, no U.S. troops on the ground, but giving the Ukrainians the means to fight for their own independence.
And Sebastian, speaking of weapons, what do you make of a recent study that says the U.S. weapons industry is unprepared for a China conflict, partly because of how much we've given to Ukraine?
I would say in part we have not marshaled our resources well. If you look at what's happened with the amount of equipment, $83 billion worth of equipment that was left on the territory of Afghanistan when Biden surrendered and left that nation precipitously last September. Also, there hasn't been a lot of thinking being done in terms of what we're supplying to Ukraine and how rapidly we're supplying it. But there are far, far broader issues than, how many bullets and bombs America has. Think of this. More than 90% of the medicines we have here in America, like antibiotics, we buy from China. If China decided that it wants to take Taiwan, it wants to get military aggressive in the Pacific region, and as a price of that, they say, oh, and by the way, we're not going to sell you the medicines that you've been buying from us for the last 30 years. Not only will we not be able to fight a multi-front war against a potential aggressor, but we probably won't have enough drugs and medicines to provide for our own citizens. So we have been in bed with communist China for far, far too long. And this is a nation with labor camps, with the Laogai system. This is a hardcore communist regime. Why we are doing business with China as the son of somebody who escaped a communist prison, I don't understand.
Yeah, well, really important points. Sebastian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. God bless.
Coming up after the break, we're joined by Robert Patillo, who's here to give us some analysis of the Atlanta riots that broke out last Saturday. Stay tuned.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Welcome back. What started as a peaceful protest last Saturday quickly went downhill when some protesters decided to throw rocks, set fires, and attack businesses around the Atlanta Police Foundation.
In response to the protest-turned-riot, Atlanta police arrested and charged 6 suspects with multiple charges, including domestic terrorism. At a press conference, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens told reporters that some among the 6 arrested were found with explosives on them. Notably, none of the 6 arrested were from Atlanta, and all but one had traveled from other states. Why? To protest the death of 26-year-old Manuel Tehran.
That's right. Manuel was shot and killed by officers earlier in the week after he allegedly fired on officers and injured one near the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center site, or Cop City as they call it. As for the officer Manuel shot, he's in stable condition and recovering from in the ICU.
So why are we seeing protests for a guy who allegedly opened fire on officers first? How do these riots impact communities? And did the police respond appropriately to the riots? Joining us to give us his analysis of the situation is Robert Patillo. Robert is a Democratic strategist and civil rights attorney. He also ran for U.S. Congress in Georgia. Robert, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why the riots? Is this really about Manuel, or is it more about the cop cities?
Well, I think that in this situation, we started with peaceful protest around this issue of Cop City, which has been a issue in the community for the last several years as we've debated it. As was mentioned, these people who were arrested were from out of state. They were not individuals that were part of the Atlanta activist community. I've been involved with the activist community here in Atlanta for over 20 years. I've participated in hundreds of peaceful protests, and we have seen kind of the proliferation of these out-of-state extremists coming city to city, coming from Portland, Oregon, coming from Seattle, Washington, and other places in many ways to stir up trouble. They're not so much interested in the cause which is being protested, which is a legitimate cause. They are simply interested in anarchy. Some people call them Antifa, some people call them anarchists, but their goal is simply to destroy property and to cause chaos, not so much to push an actual policy agenda.
Now, the protest started peacefully, but we're hearing the members of the arrested were part of the so-called Treehouse Antifa, and the riot started after the Atlanta Forest Twitter account called for a night of rage. What's your analysis on this?
My analysis is that these are people who are not from Georgia. They are not part of the community here, and their goals are not to actually bring the legitimate issues of the police training facility to the forefront, but rather to simply sow chaos and anarchy nationwide. We saw this during the George Floyd protest around the country, where suddenly pallets of bricks would show up out of nowhere, Molotov cocktails would show up out of nowhere in order to turn peaceful protest into riots. We've seen this nationwide as a both on conservative and liberal progressive protest also, where we've seen Tea Party events and MAGA events be infiltrated by individuals who seek to sow discord and to create chaos there, and then turn what was a nonviolent protest into a violent protest. On this issue of Cop City itself, there have been much contradiction in the community about an 85-acre police training facility, which many people believe will militarize further our police departments. That's a legitimate political argument, but for these anarchists, they are not interested in the political discussion or the public policy aspects. They simply want to destroy property and cause anarchy.
And Robert, Georgia Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene called on federal agencies to label Antifa and BLM as domestic terrorist groups. Should they be labeled as such? What's your take?
Absolutely not. There's a reason that we see many people on the right call Black Lives Matter BLM, because they don't want to say the words, I hate Black lives. They do not want to say, I'm against Black Lives Mattering, so they simply make up a new word, BLM, to subterfuge what is actually the issue and not to sound like bad people. What really needs to happen in this situation is that we have to start rooting out extremists, both on the left and the right, be they Proud Boys and Oath Keepers or Antifa on the right, people who are violent and who are violating the laws, but we still have to respect the ability of individuals to protest governmental overreach, to push for public policy changes, and to have the same constitutional rights as everybody else. So no, I do not support Marjorie Taylor Greene on that, but I do support the communities having the right to show their disgust or show their opposition to policies which they believe are not in the best interest in the community and are being pushed by corporate interest and special interest groups, as opposed to the voters who put people in office.
Well, I think you're actually drawing a really important point here, because I spoke with police officers, for example, dealing with some of the riots, and they did note the normal groups were typically very peaceful, including with Black Lives Matter and so on. They were normally very peaceful, but you had groups moving from out of state almost always, who were the ones really causing these trouble. Now, you said that really people should kind of disavow the extremes on both sides. Do you see these extremes as kind of making the normal, peaceful people look bad? And how do you think we should deal with this as a country?
Well, absolutely. I've argued for years that we are a 95-5 country. By that, I mean we have 90% of the people who are in the middle, who are just on varying points on issues, but within a broad majority. Then you have 5% on the far right that are absolutely insane. And then you have 5% on the far left who are equally absolutely insane. But those people are the ones who get all the attention. They get the news coverage. They get the blog posts and the videos. They're the ones who drive the outrage news cycle that is 24/7 nationwide. So you never actually get to the points that people agree on. Broadly speaking, most people agree we need safe communities. Most people agree we need better schools and better education and fair housing. Most people agree that we need to reform our society so it is less focused on making the millionaires and billionaires richer, but actually fixing the kitchen table issues that most families face. I think that we can get towards a place where people are agreeing in the center on public policy issues. That's how you actually get things done, as opposed to pushing these extreme agendas on both sides, which do not actually seek to find compromise or to fix problems. They only profit and prosper by pushing rage and division.
And Robert, on that note, the police arrested 6 people involved in the riots and charged them with domestic terrorism. So what's your take on how the police handled that situation?
I think those are the proper charges. And I think that one thing that we're going to see from Attorney General Chris Carr, who even as a Republican has broad support in the state. He was the Attorney General that prosecuted the McMichaels and the Ahmaud Arbery case, for example. We've seen him work across party lines many times. And the bigger question is going to be, with these 6 individuals, how can they help break down these terrorist networks that exist in this country? These people are clearly traveling across country to cause riots nationwide. Who's financing them? Who's putting money behind them? Who's providing transportation? What are the social media networks that are being used in order to proliferate and spread these messages? We do not want a situation where peaceful protests for public policy issues turn into police cars being burned, thousands or millions of dollars in property being destroyed by outside agitators, a term from the 1960s, who come in simply to destroy movements. Because at the end of the day, you are stepping on the same message that you are claiming you are supporting, because nobody hears the protest about the police cop city being created. They only see the destruction caused by Antifa.
Yeah, great points. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, anytime.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Thomas Hogan. He's here to discuss Washington reaching its debt ceiling and what Congress can and should do about spending. Join us after the break. Welcome back. In case you haven't heard, Washington has a spending problem. In fact, just last week, Washington hit its borrowing limit of $31.4 trillion. That's trillion with a T, and it's hard to even imagine how much money that is. So suffice it to say, America is in deep debt, and it's not going anywhere but up.
Now, the Democrats' response to this issue, well, get rid of the debt ceiling, and they believe that will help fix things with that.
And I'm not quite sure that's how it's going to work out, but I'm not an economist, so what do I know?
Well, luckily, we're joined by someone who is an economist and also currently senior research faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. He's also the former chief economist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs.
That's right. We're talking about Thomas Hogan, and he's here to discuss what Congress can and should do about the debt ceiling. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us again.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on.
So let's get right to it. What can Congress do about the debt ceiling?
Well, the main thing they can do is to spend less. You know, the debt ceiling is a partial constraint on government spending and borrowing. Every year, the government spends more and they end up borrowing most of that money. And so spending and debt increase year after year after year. The debt ceiling, once they hit the debt ceiling, they usually end up raising it. And so some people argue that, well, this is just all a show. It doesn't matter. We end up raising it every time. But I think it provides at least a partial constraint on increases in spending, because if we didn't have it, the growth in spending and borrowing would be a lot faster. And so I think it provides at least a partial constraint on that.
Now, I know Democrats are saying basically get rid of all requirements altogether, just have it so you can spend whatever you want. What should Congress do?
Well, I think they should spend and borrow a little bit less, but the main thing is that they need to think about long-term spending. And so when we think about the growth in the debt that we have, it's mostly driven by long-term programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense spending. These long-term commitments are exponentially growing and really gonna blow up the debt over a few years. And so what we need to be focusing on is those long-term issues, but they're not politically popular, and so it's very difficult to get any cuts or even to just stabilize that growth. If we could just slow the growth so that it wasn't blowing up over time, and have a more steady, slow growth of those long-term expenditures, that'd be really valuable.
And Thomas, we're hearing reports that Senator McConnell told Speaker McCarthy that essentially McCarthy is in charge of negotiating with President Biden. Why do you think McConnell is taking that approach? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You know, the Republicans have the majority in the House right now, but not in the Senate. And so in the Senate, even though McConnell's in charge there, he just doesn't have a lot of negotiating power. And so he's willing to pass that down to the less powerful House because the Republicans have a majority in the House. And so it makes sense for them to be handling those negotiations because that's where they have the leverage.
Now, I'm curious as well, could America get to the point where it defaults on its debts? And when is it likely to happen? I mean, if so?
Yeah, it's definitely worrisome. It's definitely a problem that we might end up facing that kind of situation. Like I said a minute ago, the long-term growth in spending is really a huge problem. And we're going to get to the point in a decade or two where we just can't possibly pay back the money that we've borrowed. And so in the long term, that's the most significant worry about defaulting on the debt, is just that we're going to have so much debt that we can't possibly pay it back. In the short term, this problem about the debt ceiling is also worrisome. You know, that's the thing that we're facing immediately. And what normally happens in this kind of debate is that there is some wrangling between the Republican and Democrat Party to see if they can come to an agreement. And if they can't before we hit the limit, then there can be a government shutdown, not a full shutdown. They send home the non-essential workers, which is about half of the government, and then end up, a few weeks later coming to an agreement. And so that could happen here. But Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, has put a lot of safeguards in place so that the government can continue paying its bills for another 6 months, which could just prolong this whole thing. We might be talking about this for another 6 months every night on the news, if this continues to be an issue. So because they put those safeguards in place, this negotiation may take a lot longer.
And Thomas, speaking of the debt itself, it seems 33% of America's debt is owned by foreign investors. Two of the biggest are China and Japan. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that is something that is kind of debated among economists about whether that's a problem. You know, on one hand, we do worry that it means that if something happens, they might just stop buying our debt for some reason. But the truth is, the United States is a much more responsible government and a stronger growing economy compared to almost anywhere else in the world. And so I'm not really worried about them not buying our debt. I actually think it's an advantage because if we were in a situation where we did have to default, at least the people we would not be paying back would be foreigners like, you know, China and whoever else is owners of our debt. That's better than not being able to pay back Americans. And so some people have even talked about we might strategically default if we were facing a situation where we couldn't afford to pay our bills. We would tell foreign countries like, hey, we just can't pay you. We can pay some of our people, but not others, right? And so I actually think that situation of foreigners being willing to invest in the United States, that is an advantage to us. It gives us a little bit of leeway if we did have that kind of problem.
I guess just 20 seconds left. It seems like interest rates are going up. I mean, we're spending as much on interest as we are on the defense budget at this point. How much further can that go while we still can have like a functioning country at this rate?
Yeah, that is a big problem. Some people say that the Federal Reserve should be worried about that, and they're really not. I think they're more focused on the current economy. I think, like we were saying a minute ago, that's really a problem about just the size of the debt and something that Congress needs to focus on, just not spending way more money than we're bringing in taxes. That's the real solution.
Great. Thank you for taking the time for this.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And that's all from us here tonight on Newsmakers. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday for a brand new episode.
Until then, good night, everyone.